The Galactic Survival Certification Program maintained an excellent safety record, a comprehensive curriculum, and a peculiar double standard that nobody seemed willing to acknowledge in official documentation. Garen Voss noticed this approximately 30 seconds after instructor Quarrel, a being whose species had evolved on a desert planet and consequently treated moisture with religious reverence, confiscated his water purification tablets. The tablets joined Garen's knife, fire starter, cordage, tarp, and emergency beacon in a transparent containment sphere that hummed with what sounded suspiciously like smugness. Standard protocol, Quarrel explained, his translator rendering his clicking mandibles into flat, bureaucratic galactic common. All students begin the practical examination with equivalent resources to ensure fairness. Garen glanced at the Hevrian student, 3 spots down the line, who was being fitted with a thermal regulation suit because his species literally couldn't survive overnight without external temperature control. 2 spots beyond that, a Tellurian, whose homeworld had never developed anything resembling a forest, received a laminated guide to local flora and fauna, complete with pictures. Garen looked back at his empty hands. Equivalent, he repeated. Your species has demonstrated sufficient adaptability, Instructor Yintha added. She belonged to a race that communicated primarily through color shifts in their dermal layers, which made her translated voice sound oddly emotionless. You require no compensatory equipment. The logic was airtight if you didn't think about it too hard. Humans could technically survive in this environment without tools. Therefore, humans would survive in this environment without tools. The fact that could and would occupied different philosophical zip codes didn't appear in the curriculum guidelines. Garen shouldered his empty pack. They'd at least let him keep the bag itself, presumably because it was just fabric and thus didn't count as technology, and walked toward the drop shuttle. Behind him, Quarrel and Yintha began discussing optimal distribution patterns for the supply caches that would be available to students who needed them. Garen had heard enough to understand he wouldn't be on that particular list. The shuttle deposited him in Zone 7 at approximately 1400 hours local time. The planet designated Kepler 1649c in human catalogues, though the Galactic Survey had given it an unpronounceable official name, maintained a 22-hour rotation, and hosted a forest biome that Earth's botanists would have found fascinatingly alien and fundamentally comprehensible. Trees were trees, more or less. Leaves photosynthesized, roots anchored, and gravity pulled everything downward with predictable consistency. Garen stood in a small clearing where the shuttle had created a temporary gap in the canopy. The air smelled like petrichor and something faintly citric. The canopy filtered sunlight into a greenish dimness that would make navigation interesting. From somewhere to his left, he heard running water. To his right, something crashed through underbrush with enough weight to be worth avoiding. He had approximately 6 hours until full dark. The first rule of survival, which the instructors had spent 3 weeks drilling into their students through lectures and simulations, was to secure immediate needs: shelter, water, fire, food, in that order. The second rule was to use your available tools efficiently and maintain your equipment. Garen looked at his empty hands again and decided the rules required interpretation rather than literal application. He began walking, not randomly but in a deliberate spiral pattern outward from his drop point, marking his path by breaking small branches at consistent heights. The undergrowth varied from dense to sparse, suggesting either different soil conditions or different light penetration. He found the stream within 20 minutes, a clear, fast-moving channel about 3 meters wide, shallow enough to see rounded stones on the bottom. He knelt and tasted it cautiously. Cold, clean, slightly mineral. Probably safe, though he'd need to boil it to be certain. Following the stream upstream, he discovered what he'd been hoping for, an overhang in a stone outcrop where water had undercut softer rock layers, creating a natural shelf about 2 meters deep and 4 meters wide. The ground beneath sloped gently away from the rock face, which meant drainage. The overhang itself would shed rain. The stream provided water and would mask sounds from his camp. The site had disadvantages: exposure to wind from the open side, visibility from across the stream, but darkness was coming, and perfect didn't exist. Garen spent the remaining daylight gathering materials, not building yet, just gathering. An armload of dry leaves and grass for insulation, several large fronds that might serve as rudimentary ground cover, deadwood in various sizes, from twig to forearm thickness. He piled everything under the overhang and arranged himself in the driest, most protected corner as the light faded. The night was educational. The temperature dropped but remained tolerable. The sounds multiplied, calls and responses in registers from subsonic rumbles to ultrasonic chirps that he felt more than heard. Bioluminescent fungi emerged on several nearby trees, casting pale blue light that created more shadows than illumination. Something large moved past his shelter around midnight, snuffling at the ground. Garen remained very still and very quiet until it moved on. He didn't sleep so much as hover in a state of exhausted alertness, which gave him plenty of time to think. The instructors wanted to see adaptability, resource management and problem solving under stress. They'd removed his tools to create that stress. Fair enough. The trick was recognizing that tools weren't the same thing as technology. Technology was understanding. Tools were just the application. Dawn arrived gradually, the bioluminescence fading as natural light strengthened. Garen's back ached from the stone. His clothes were damp from condensation, and his mouth tasted like he'd been chewing bark. He drank from the stream, splashed water on his face, and began his education in Zone 7's particular character. The morning reconnaissance took 3 hours. He moved in expanding circuits from his shelter, this time paying attention to different details. Not just where things were, but what they were and how they might be useful. The trees with straight trunks and minimal branching until the canopy. The vines that grew in thick tangles, some fibrous and flexible, others woody and rigid. The clusters of plants near the stream, with broad waxy leaves that shed water efficiently. The rocky areas where the stream had previously run, now dry but littered with stones of various sizes and compositions. He found a spot where the stream curved sharply, creating a small beach of deposited sediment and stones. Garen knelt and began selecting rocks, testing them by striking them together. Most produced dull thuds. Some rang with a clearer tone. A few dark grey, fine-grained with a glassy texture when he looked closely, fractured predictably when struck at the right angle. Flint, or something functionally similar. The problem with making stone tools, Garen reflected as he sat cross-legged on his beach and began carefully striking rocks together, was that every piece of pop culture made it look either impossibly difficult or absurdly easy. Reality occupied an annoying middle ground. The physics were straightforward: apply force at the correct angle to a stone with the right internal structure, and pieces would flake off in predictable ways, creating sharp edges. Understanding the physics didn't make your first 20 attempts any less frustrating. He broke 4 rocks completely. He created 7 useless chunks. He cut his thumb on a shard that fractured in an unexpected direction. On his 12th attempt, he produced something that could generously be called a hand axe, a fist-sized stone with one edge sharper than the others, crude but functional. It took another hour to make 3 more tools, two smaller flakes with razor edges, suitable for cutting, and another hand axe as backup. They wouldn't win any archaeological exhibitions, but they'd cut plant matter and maybe shape wood. That was enough. The vines proved equally educational. Garin had identified 5 distinct varieties during his morning survey. 2 were too rigid. 1 secreted a sap that made his fingers itch. The remaining 2 showed promise, one thick as his thumb, tough and flexible, and another thinner but present in abundance. He cut sections with his stone flakes, awkward, slow work that made him miss his confiscated knife with genuine longing, and brought them back to camp. Testing cordage materials was tedious. He tried twisting single strands. They broke. He tried braiding 3 strands, better, but still weak at the knots. He tried stripping the outer bark from the thicker vine, revealing fibrous inner layers that could be separated and twisted. That worked. By the time the light began fading on his second day, he had perhaps 20 meters of rough cordage in various lengths, none of it pretty, all of it stronger than it looked. The narrator observing this process might note that nothing about it was dramatic. No sudden revelations, no montage of increasingly impressive successes, no triumphant music swelling in the background. Just a human sitting in the dirt, trying things, failing, trying again, slowly accumulating knowledge through repetition. It was the kind of work that made for terrible viewing but decent survival. That night, Garin slept slightly better, mostly because exhaustion had caught up with him. The shelter took 3 days to build properly. Not because the construction itself was complex, but because every component required manufacture from raw materials. He needed straight poles for the frame, which meant finding appropriate saplings, cutting them with stone tools, a process that involved more patience than force, and trimming branches. He needed the poles to be specific lengths, which required measurement using his own body as a reference, and multiple attempts to get proportions right. The frame emerged as a simple A-frame design, leaning against the rock overhang. 2 main support poles formed the peak, braced by horizontal crosspieces lashed with vine cordage. The lashing itself required learning proper knots through trial and error. Square lashing, diagonal lashing, shear lashing, concepts Garin had encountered in documentation, but never physically practiced. His first attempts slipped loose. His later attempts held. He built a lattice of smaller branches across the frame, creating a surface to layer waterproofing. The broad waxy leaves he'd identified went on in overlapping rows, each layer secured with thin vine strips woven through the lattice. The result looked organic, almost like the shelter was growing from the forest rather than imposed upon it. Rain tested his work on the 4th night, a steady downpour that lasted hours. Garin lay in his shelter, listening to water drum on leaves and watching a few drips penetrate his roofing where leaves had torn or shifted. He marked the weak points and repaired them the next morning. The fire pit required different thinking. Garin had the theoretical knowledge, friction methods, bow drills, the relationship between tinder and kindling, and fuel wood. Theory and practice maintained their traditional hostile relationship. His first bow drill, constructed from a curved branch and more precious cordage, broke on the 3rd attempt. The wood wasn't dry enough. His second attempt produced smoke, but no ember. The wood was too soft. His 3rd attempt, using harder wood for the drill and softer wood for the baseboard, produced an ember that died before reaching his tinder bundle. His 4th attempt succeeded on his 6th day in Zone 7, producing a small precious coal that he transferred to a nest of dry grass and bark fiber, blowing gently until it bloomed into flame. The fire itself was tiny, almost pathetic, but it represented something fundamental, the conversion of knowledge and effort into heat and light. Garin fed it carefully, building it up in a stone-lined depression he'd prepared, and felt something in his chest unclench. With fire, shelter, water and basic tools established, Garin's existence shifted from crisis management to routine maintenance. He woke at first light, a habit that developed naturally without alarm clocks or schedules. The fire required tending, adding wood to coals he'd banked overnight. His water collection system, a series of broad leaves arranged to funnel dew and rain into a stone depression he'd shaped and sealed with clay from the stream bank, needed emptying and cleaning. His tools required inspection for cracks or dullness. His cordage needed checking for rot or wear. He'd set several simple traps along animal trails, figure-4 deadfalls constructed from flat stones and trigger sticks, positioned where he'd observed small creatures moving. The traps failed more often than they succeeded, but occasional success provided protein to supplement the plant foods he'd identified as edible through cautious testing. Nothing dramatic, small rodent equivalents that he cleaned with stone tools and cooked over his fire. The work was messy and took practice to do efficiently. The camp grew organically around him. A raised sleeping platform of lashed poles and woven branches got him off the cold ground. A smoke rack above his fire let him preserve meat from successful hunts. A stone-lined channel diverted water from his shelter during heavy rain. Each addition emerged from observation rather than planning. He noticed problems, watched how the environment behaved, and created solutions using available materials. His hands changed. Calluses developed across his palms and fingers. Small cuts and scrapes healed into thin scars. His movements became more economical, less wasted motion, the kind of efficiency that emerged from repeating the same tasks daily. The forest stopped feeling alien and started feeling like a place where he knew which paths led to good tool stone, which areas held edible plants, where water flowed fastest for washing, which trees marked the boundaries of his comfortable range. Time acquired a different quality. Without clocks or schedules, days measured themselves in tasks completed and light available. Garin found himself noticing details he would have ignored in a more structured environment, how certain insects only appeared after rain, how the angle of light through the canopy shifted as the planet's seasons changed, how animal behavior patterns revealed more about the ecosystem than any database could document. The other students remained distant presences. Occasionally he heard voices or saw smoke from other camps. Once a Hevrian stumbled into his area, clearly lost, clutching a standard-issue navigation device that had apparently malfunctioned. Garin provided directions back to the central supply cache and watched the student hurry away, apparently uncomfortable with how little Garin's camp resembled the standard shelter configurations taught in training. On day 18, the instructors arrived. Garin heard the approach before he saw them, the characteristic whine of repulsor fields and the sharp ozone smell of atmospheric ionization. He was working on a new cutting tool when Coral and Yentha emerged into his camp clearing, followed by 2 assistant instructors carrying monitoring equipment. Student Voss, Coral's translator, rendered his greeting in the same flat bureaucratic tone. "We are conducting midterm evaluations." Garin set down his stone and stood. "Understood." Yentha's dermal patterns shifted through several colors that the translator didn't bother interpreting. She approached the shelter, running a scanning device along the frame. "You constructed this?" "Yes." Without tools, Garin gestured at his pile of stone implements. "I made tools." Coral picked up one of the hand axes, examining it with what might have been curiosity or confusion. His species didn't have particularly expressive faces. "Primitive manufacture. Stone Age technology. Effective technology," Garin corrected mildly. "It cuts what I need cut." The evaluation continued for an hour. The instructors tested his cordage strength with measurement devices, documented his water collection and filtration system. Garen had eventually created a multi-layer filter using charcoal, sand and woven grass, and observed his food preservation techniques. They asked questions about his methodology, resource management, and long-term sustainability plans. Garen answered honestly. He'd observed the local stone varieties and selected the most workable. He'd tested different plant fibers for cordage. He'd noted animal patterns to optimize trap placement. He'd positioned his shelter for optimal protection and resource access. Everything he explained followed straightforward cause and effect reasoning based on environmental observation. The instructors exchanged what Garen had learned to recognize as significant glances. Yentha's colors shifted into patterns that suggested either concern or thoughtfulness. Coral's mandibles clicked in sequences that the translator ignored. "Your approach," Yentha finally said, "represents inefficient resource allocation compared to modern standards. The time investment required to manufacture primitive tools exceeds the efficiency gain from using standard equipment available at supply caches." "I didn't have access to supply caches," Garen pointed out. "You could have signaled for basic provisions," Coral added. "Protocol allows for emergency supply requests." "I wasn't having an emergency." Another glance between the instructors. Coral set down the hand axe. "Your methodology demonstrates concerning self-sufficiency independent of technological support systems. The Galactic Survival Certification Program emphasizes integration with modern resource networks and appropriate help-seeking behavior." Garen considered this. "You removed all my equipment to test my adaptability." "I adapted within expected parameters," Yentha said, though her colors suggested this might not be entirely accurate. They completed their documentation in silence, taking images and measurements, scanning his camp with enough equipment to outfit a research expedition. Before leaving, Coral informed him that he was passing the certification requirements, but that his unconventional methodology would be noted in official records. Garen wasn't sure if that represented approval or concern, possibly both. The days after the evaluation felt anticlimactic. Garen continued his routines, refined his tools, improved his camp infrastructure. The work had its own momentum now, each task leading naturally to the next. On day 30, a message drone arrived announcing the end of the certification period. Students should prepare for extraction within 48 hours. Garen spent those final 2 days methodically dismantling his camp. He scattered the shelter framework back into the forest, returned stones to the stream, filled in his fire pit. The work felt oddly melancholy, erasing evidence of a month's habitation. By the time the extraction shuttle arrived, his camp looked nearly undisturbed, just another clearing in the forest, where nothing particularly interesting had happened. The shuttle ride back to the certification station was crowded with students comparing experiences. Most discussed the challenges of maintaining prefab equipment in field conditions, strategies for optimizing supply cache routes, and the relative merits of different standard-issue tools. A few asked Garen about his experience. He described it briefly. Built a shelter, made some tools, stayed dry and fed. They nodded politely and returned to their own conversations. The certification ceremony was efficient and bureaucratic. Each student received their documentation, feedback on their performance, and recommendations for future training. Garen's evaluation noted his passing marks and included an appendix longer than some students' entire assessments, detailing his alternative approach to resource utilization and demonstration of pre-technological survival methodologies. He was reading through this appendix in the station's transit lounge when instructor Yentha approached. Her colors were muted, harder to read than usual. "Your certification was discussed at length among the evaluation committee," she said without preamble. "I gathered that from the appendix length. There is debate about whether future human students should face additional equipment restrictions," her colors shifted, "or whether such restrictions would merely prove counterproductive." Garen looked up from his datapad. "What's the concern exactly?" "The Galactic Survival Certification Program assesses ability to function within established support systems during crisis situations. You demonstrated ability to function independent of those systems." She paused. "This creates philosophical complications for program objectives." "I used what was available," Garen said. "Same as everyone else." "You created what was available," Yentha corrected. "There is a difference." She left before he could respond, her colors fading into neutral patterns. Garen returned to his datapad, scrolling through the rest of his evaluation. Somewhere in the administrative language and technical assessments was an unspoken question. What did it mean when removing someone's tools didn't create dependency, but merely changed which tools they used? The thought followed him as he boarded his departure shuttle and watched the certification station recede into orbital distance. Below, the forest moon where he'd spent a month rotated peacefully, its surface unmarked by his presence. The trees continued growing, the streams continued flowing. The stones remained stones, waiting for the next person to recognize them as potential rather than obstacles. Back on the station, in an office Garen would never see, a committee was probably already discussing protocol revisions for human students. Additional restrictions, or perhaps different assessment criteria, or maybe a complete re-evaluation of what equivalent resources actually meant when one species' empty hands could become another species' entire toolkit through nothing more than observation and patience. The shuttle engaged its faster-than-light drive, and the moon disappeared into the statistical average of countless other worlds where someone had once needed shelter and found it. Garen closed his eyes and felt the ghost sensation of calluses on his palms, the muscle memory of cordage knots and stone flaking angles, the quiet satisfaction of having turned nothing into enough. The instructors had taken every tool. They'd probably file reports about it, discuss implications, revise their procedures. Somewhere down there, vines continued growing around tree trunks, and stones lay in streams, and humans remained unsettlingly capable of noticing these facts and acting accordingly.